For 3 years, Ruth quietly cleaned her billionaire son Derek's office every night, holding back tears as she straightened his childhood photo and cared for him from the shadows, while he remained too busy chasing success to realize that the mother he had stopped calling was only a glass door away. The hallway on the 41st floor was almost silent at 11:48 on a Wednesday night. The only sound came from the soft squeak of rubber wheels rolling across polished marble as a gray-haired janitor slowly pushed her cleaning cart toward the corner office. Her name badge simply read, Ruth. No last name, no title, just one small word that almost no one in the building had ever bothered to read. At 68 years old, she moved a little slower than the younger workers, but every movement was careful, almost gentle, as if she believed every floor deserved the same respect as a family home. By sunrise, executives would walk through spotless hallways carrying expensive briefcases and fresh coffee, never wondering who had been there long before dawn. They would see clean glass, empty trash cans, and shining desks. They would never see Ruth. When she reached the last office at the end of the hallway, she stopped without making a sound. Through the glass wall, she could see the large walnut desk, the leather chair, the city lights stretching across Atlanta, and a row of framed photographs sitting neatly on a bookshelf. Her eyes settled on one picture longer than the others. A little boy, no older than 4, was laughing while a young woman held him close. The corners of Ruth's lips lifted into the smallest smile, the kind that appears without anyone noticing. She rested one hand lightly on the handle of her cart and stayed there for a few quiet seconds. It wasn't because she was tired. It was because those few seconds were the part of the night she treasured most. After taking one slow breath, she unlocked the office and stepped inside as carefully as if she were entering a church. She never rushed through this room. She straightened every book until the edges lined up perfectly. She wiped fingerprints from the glass without leaving a single streak behind. She replaced the dying flowers with fresh ones brought from the lobby whenever she could. If a picture frame leaned even slightly to one side, she gently fixed it before anyone else would ever notice. Sometimes she even paused to fold a blanket that had slipped from the back of the office sofa. None of these things were written in her job description. Nobody checked to see if she had done them. Nobody thanked her, yet she did them every single night with the same quiet care. As she emptied the trash can beside the desk, she noticed the wrapper of a chocolate caramel candy. She picked it up, smiled to herself, and whispered so softly that even the empty office could barely hear her. "You still like these?" For a brief moment, her face looked less like a tired janitor finishing another shift, and more like a mother remembering a little boy who used to hide those same candies under his pillow because he wanted to save them for later. The memory warmed her heart for only a second before she folded the wrapper into the trash bag and continued working as though nothing had happened. Most people would have assumed she needed the paycheck. It was an easy conclusion to make when they saw an older woman cleaning office buildings long after midnight. But they would have been wrong. Ruth owned her small house. She had enough savings to live comfortably. She could have spent her evenings watching television, reading books, or resting her aching knees. Instead, every night, she put on a navy blue uniform, drove across the city, and cleaned an office that belonged to someone who had no idea she was there. She wasn't chasing money. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She came for one simple reason that no one in the building could have guessed. The man who worked in this office meant more to her than anything else in the world. And being only a few steps away from him, even if he never saw her, somehow made the loneliness a little easier to carry. By 7 o'clock every morning, Derek Gaines was already halfway through his first cup of black coffee. His phone never stopped buzzing. Emails, meetings, investors, lawyers, board members. Someone always needed him. At 42 years old, he had become one of the most respected business leaders in Atlanta. Financial magazines called him a visionary. Young entrepreneurs dreamed of becoming him. Employees admired his confidence whenever he walked through the lobby. His signature could approve deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars in just a few seconds. From the outside, Derek looked like a man who had already won at life. His company occupied the top floor of one of the tallest buildings in the city. The building even carried his last name in shining silver letters above the entrance. Every morning, assistants greeted him with his favorite coffee before he even asked. His schedule was planned weeks in advance: breakfast with investors, strategy meetings, conference calls with clients overseas, lunch with developers, dinner with board members. By the time he returned to his luxury penthouse each night, the city lights were already glowing beneath his windows. Most people would have looked at his life with envy. They saw the expensive suits, the private driver, the awards hanging on his office wall, and the headlines celebrating another successful deal. They thought he had everything anyone could ever want. But there was another side to Derek's life that nobody ever saw. His dining table could seat 10 people, yet most nights only one plate was ever used. The silence inside his home was so familiar that he hardly noticed it anymore. His refrigerator was full, but most of the food expired before anyone touched it. His birthday came and went with polite emails from coworkers instead of hugs from family. His phone held thousands of business contacts, but there wasn't a single person he felt comfortable calling just to say, "Can we talk?" Somewhere along the way, success had filled every hour of his life while quietly pushing everyone else out. People often asked Derek how he managed to stay so focused. They thought discipline was his greatest strength. The truth was much simpler. Work had become the safest place for him to hide. As long as another meeting was waiting, he never had to think about the empty apartment that greeted him every night. As long as another deal demanded his attention, he never had to notice how many family dinners he had missed. His calendar was packed from sunrise until long after sunset, leaving almost no empty spaces. But the emptier his schedule became, the louder the silence around him felt. Deep inside, there was a space no amount of money, success, or recognition had ever been able to fill. Without realizing it, the man who seemed to own everything had slowly lost the people who mattered most. Sunday evenings were the hardest part of Ruth's week. She didn't dread Monday. She didn't fear growing older. She feared the quiet that always arrived around 6:45 p.m. Every Sunday, she made herself a cup of tea, placed it on the little table beside the telephone, and sat in the same chair by the living room window. It had become a routine she never talked about. She didn't turn on the television because she didn't want to miss the sound of the phone. Sometimes she picked up a book, but she rarely read more than a page. Her eyes kept drifting back to the phone, hoping it would ring. Outside, neighbors laughed with their families, children rode bicycles down the street, and cars pulled into driveways after weekend trips. Inside her house, only the ticking clock kept her company. The phone stayed silent. It had stayed silent for months, yet every Sunday she believed, maybe this week. She never counted how many Sundays had passed. She never crossed dates off a calendar. She simply waited until the evening grew dark enough to tell her it wasn't going to happen again. Then she smiled to herself, not because she wasn't disappointed, but because she refused to let disappointment become bitterness. She gently touched the phone before standing up and quietly said, "He's probably buried in work again. Maybe next Sunday." There was no anger in her voice, no complaint, just the kind of understanding only a mother could give, even when it broke her own heart a little more each time. People often think loneliness is about having no one around. Ruth had learned it was something different. Loneliness was wanting to tell your child about the flowers blooming in your front yard, about the pie you baked that turned out just right, or about the funny neighbor who waved every morning, and realizing there was no one to call. She still cooked enough food for 2 on Sundays out of habit. Before putting the leftovers into the refrigerator, she would pause for a second, looking at the empty chair across the table. Then she would quietly clear it away, telling herself not to be foolish. She had spent years teaching Derek to chase his dreams. She could never resent him for catching them. Money had never been a problem. Derek had been sending money to her account every month for years. The house was paid for. Her bills were small. If she wanted to, she could spend her days gardening, visiting friends, or traveling. But none of those things could replace hearing her son's laugh. None of them could fill the empty seat at her dinner table. She didn't want expensive gifts. She didn't need a bigger house. She only missed the ordinary moments that used to come so easily. A quick hug before school, a short conversation over breakfast, hearing him say, "I'll be home soon." Those simple moments had become priceless because they were gone. One afternoon, while driving home from the grocery store, Ruth stopped at a traffic light and looked up at the skyline in the distance. One building stood taller than the others, its glass windows shining in the afternoon sun. She knew exactly whose office was at the very top. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel as a quiet thought crossed her mind. She didn't need him to know she was there. She didn't need to interrupt his life or make him feel guilty. If she could simply be close to him, even for a few minutes each night, maybe the distance between them wouldn't feel so painful anymore. The next morning, instead of going back home after breakfast, Ruth walked into a commercial cleaning company's office and asked if they were hiring. The manager glanced at her gray hair and asked gently, "Are you sure you want this kind of work? It's long hours." Ruth smiled politely and answered, "I'm stronger than I look." He handed her an application, never realizing that the woman sitting across from him wasn't looking for a paycheck. She was looking for a way back into her son's world without asking him to make room for her. When she later saw the assignment sheet with the name of Derek's office tower printed at the top, her eyes filled with quiet tears. She folded the paper carefully, slipped it into her purse, and whispered, "This is enough. I can see my boy again." She had no idea that one small decision, made in complete silence, would change both of their lives forever. By the end of her first month, Ruth knew Derek's office better than anyone else in the building. She knew which window caught the first light every morning and which chair he always pulled out during long meetings. She knew he usually left one coffee mug by the machine before rushing home, and she noticed he had a habit of leaving books open with small sticky notes tucked between the pages. To everyone else, it was just another executive office. To Ruth, it still felt like taking care of her son's room. Every night she unlocked the glass door, smiled softly, and whispered, "I'm here, sweetheart," before beginning her work. No one ever heard those words. They were never meant for anyone else. Cleaning the office took longer than it needed to, but Ruth never hurried. She lined every book up until their edges matched perfectly. If one picture frame leaned a little to the left, she gently straightened it before dusting the shelf. Whenever the flowers near the window started to fade, she quietly replaced them with fresh ones from the lobby before anyone noticed they were dying. She wiped fingerprints from the desk, polished the glass walls until they reflected the city lights, and before leaving each night, she placed a clean coffee cup beside the machine, exactly where Derek liked to find it every morning. It wasn't part of her job. No manager had ever asked her to do those little things. She simply knew that small acts of care often meant the most because they were done without expecting anything in return. The office staff often praised how spotless the executive floor looked. Some assumed the cleaning company had raised its standards. Others joked that the CEO must have hired someone special for his office. Derek hardly thought about it at all. He would arrive each morning, grab the clean cup waiting beside the coffee machine, notice the fresh flowers without really seeing them, and begin another day filled with meetings. The room always felt peaceful, but he never stopped to wonder why. He simply believed everything was exactly as it should be. Meanwhile, the woman who quietly made that feeling possible had already gone home before sunrise, carrying her tired body but a slightly lighter heart. One rainy Thursday night, Ruth emptied the trash can beside Derek's desk and noticed something that made her stop. Mixed in with meeting notes and empty coffee cups was the wrapper from a small caramel candy. She picked it up carefully and turned it over in her hands. A gentle smile spread across her face almost immediately. It was the exact same candy Derek used to beg for at the grocery store when he was a little boy. Every Friday after school, she would let him choose one treat, and without fail, he always reached for those caramel candies. She could still picture him stuffing 2 pieces into his pockets, insisting he was saving them for tomorrow, even though they were always gone before bedtime. Ruth held the wrapper for another moment, laughing quietly to herself. "You never outgrew these," she whispered. For just a second, the glass office disappeared. In her mind, she wasn't standing on the 41st floor of a skyscraper. She was back in a small neighborhood kitchen, watching an 8-year-old boy grin with sticky caramel on his fingers. That memory warmed her more than any paycheck ever could. She gently placed the wrapper back into the trash bag, wiped away the small tear gathering in the corner of her eye, and finished cleaning the desk as if nothing had happened. Before leaving, Ruth stood beside the coffee machine one last time. She placed a fresh cup where Derek would find it in the morning, looked around the office to make sure everything was perfect, and quietly turned off the lights. As the glass door closed behind her, the room looked warm and welcoming, almost as if someone who truly loved its owner had been there. In a way, someone had. Derek would walk into that office again in just a few hours, never realizing that the person who cared for it every single night had once tucked him into bed, packed his school lunches, and kissed his forehead before he fell asleep. And while he hurried toward another busy day, his mother quietly disappeared into the darkness, carrying another memory home with her. The distance between Ruth and Derek was surprisingly small. Every weekday morning, she finished cleaning the executive floor just before the first employees arrived. Around the same time, Derek's car pulled into the underground garage, always within a few minutes of the schedule printed on his calendar. One was ending the day while the other was beginning his. Most mornings, less than a single hallway separated them. Ruth knew exactly what time the elevator usually opened. She had memorized the rhythm without ever trying. The soft chime would echo through the quiet floor, and before the doors fully opened, she would quietly push her cart toward the emergency stairwell. She never ran. She simply disappeared before anyone had the chance to notice her. One morning, everything happened a little differently. Ruth had just finished wiping the glass wall outside Derek's office when she heard the familiar sound of the elevator arriving earlier than usual. Her heart skipped for a moment. She glanced toward the hallway and saw the elevator doors beginning to slide open. Without making a sound, she guided her cart into the nearby stairwell and gently pulled the heavy door closed, leaving only the smallest crack. Through that narrow opening, she watched Derek step onto the executive floor. He walked past her without looking in her direction, his eyes already focused on the phone in his hand. They were separated by less than 10 feet, close enough that she could have reached out and touched his shoulder if the wall had not been between them. Ruth stayed perfectly still until his footsteps disappeared into the office. Only then did she let out the breath she had been holding. She smiled to herself, not because seeing him from a distance was enough, but because seeing him at all was a gift she never expected to have again. "You look tired," she whispered under her breath. "I hope you slept a little more last night." She waited another minute before quietly carrying her cart down the stairs, making sure she would never cross his path. To Derek, it was just another ordinary morning. He had no idea someone had been only a few feet away, looking at him with the same love she had carried since the day he was born. A few weeks later, another morning almost changed everything. Ruth was cleaning the break area outside the executive offices when she heard a harsh cough echo through the hallway, then another, and another. It wasn't the quick cough of someone clearing their throat. It was deep, painful, the kind that came after too many nights without real sleep. She froze immediately. Every mother knows the sound of her child in pain, even after years apart. She slowly turned toward the office, her hands still gripping the mop handle. Through the glass wall, she could see Derek leaning over the counter beside the coffee machine, one hand pressed against it as he struggled to catch his breath. Without thinking, Ruth took one step forward. Every instinct inside her told her to open the door. She wanted to ask if he was feeling sick. She wanted to tell him to slow down, to get some rest, to stop drinking so much coffee on an empty stomach. For one brief moment, she wasn't a janitor standing outside a CEO's office. She was simply a mother watching her son push himself too hard. Her hand even reached toward the door handle before she suddenly stopped. If she walked in now, everything would change. The secret she had protected for so long would disappear in a single second. Tears filled her eyes as she slowly lowered her hand. "You'll be okay," she whispered, though he could never hear her. "You've always been stronger than you think." She waited until his coughing settled, then quietly turned away and pushed her cart toward the service elevator. Behind her, Derek picked up his coffee and returned to another day of meetings, never realizing the person who wanted to take care of him more than anyone else had been standing just outside his office door. Ruth stepped into the elevator, the doors closed, and once again, mother and son missed each other by only a few moments. Neither of them knew that fate was bringing them closer with every passing day. The first sign of trouble came on a Thursday afternoon, when a deal Derek had spent more than a year building disappeared in less than 10 minutes. The project was worth nearly $200 million, and everyone at the company believed it would be the biggest win of the year. Derek sat at the head of the conference table while his lawyer explained that the investors had chosen another firm. No one in the room moved. His board members avoided looking at him, as if disappointment could spread through eye contact. Derek closed the folder in front of him and said, "We'll recover. Find the next opportunity." His voice sounded calm, but under the table, his right hand was shaking. The loss created a crack that quickly grew wider. Two major investors delayed their funding. A bank began asking questions about the company's debt. Board members who once praised Derek's bold decisions now called them reckless. Some started meeting without him, speaking quietly behind closed doors about whether he was still the right person to lead the company. Derek knew those meetings were happening, but he pretended not to care. He worked longer hours, reviewed every contract himself, and refused to let anyone see how frightened he had become. He had built the company from almost nothing, and the thought of losing it felt like losing proof that every sacrifice in his life had been worth it. At night, the fear followed him home. Derek would lie in his large bedroom staring at the ceiling, exhausted but unable to sleep. When he finally closed his eyes, he saw numbers, deadlines, and faces waiting for answers he did not have. Some nights, he slept for less than 3 hours before getting up and putting on another suit. His back ached constantly, and a sharp pain had started spreading across his stomach whenever the phone rang. A doctor told him the pain was caused by stress and warned him that his body was reaching its limit. Derek thanked him, left the office, and joined a business call from the parking lot. A few days later, Derek was alone in his office when his chest suddenly tightened. He tried to take a deep breath, but the air seemed to stop halfway into his lungs. His hands went cold, and the room began to feel smaller. For a terrifying moment, he thought he was having a heart attack. He reached for his phone, then stopped because he did not know who to call. There were executives who needed his decisions, lawyers who needed his signature, and employees who depended on his company. But there was no close friend who would come sit beside him without asking about business. So Derek stayed on the floor behind his desk until his breathing returned, then stood up, fixed his tie, and joined his next meeting. No one noticed what had happened. His employees saw the same confident man walk into the conference room and begin talking about recovery plans. They did not see the wet paper towel he had pressed against his face minutes earlier. They did not know that he had started keeping pain medicine in his desk drawer, or that he sometimes sat in his car for 20 minutes because he did not want to enter his empty penthouse. He had spent years becoming the person everyone depended on, but he had forgotten how to depend on anyone else. Even when he felt himself falling apart, asking for help seemed more frightening than the fall itself. One night, after another board meeting ended badly, Derek remained in the office long after everyone left. He stood near the window and looked down at the city he once believed he had conquered. The streets were full of homes where families were eating dinner, arguing over small things, laughing at television shows, and asking one another how their day had been. Derek could buy almost anything he saw from that window, yet he had nowhere he truly wanted to go. His phone lit up with an old weekly reminder he had ignored for months. "Call Mom." He stared at the words until the screen went dark, then placed the phone face down on his desk. A few minutes later, He began coughing so hard that he had to hold the edge of the table to stay upright. Outside the glass office, hidden in the dark hallway, Ruth had arrived earlier than usual. She heard every cough. She saw her son bend over the desk, alone and struggling, while the city continued shining behind him as if nothing was wrong. Her hand moved toward the door, and this time she nearly opened it. But before she could, Derek straightened his jacket, picked up another file, and forced himself back into his chair. Ruth stood there with tears in her eyes, realizing that the powerful man everyone admired was quietly breaking apart. She had come to be near her son because she missed him. Now she began to wonder whether simply being near him was no longer enough. The next morning, Ruth found Derek asleep at his desk. His jacket was hanging over the back of the chair, his tie was loose, and one hand still rested on an open financial report. A cup of coffee had gone cold beside him. For a few seconds, Ruth forgot about the uniform she was wearing and the secret she was trying to protect. She only saw her son, exhausted and alone, sleeping in the same uncomfortable position he used to fall asleep in while studying for college exams. Back then, she would cover him with a blanket and turn off the lamp. Now, she could not even touch his shoulder without changing everything. She quietly backed out of the office and waited in the hallway until he woke up and left for an early meeting. That night, the desk was covered with reports, rejected proposals, and notes from the board. Ruth could tell he had been working under pressure, even if she did not understand every number on the pages. In the trash, she found a broken pen and a sheet of paper with one sentence written across it. "I can't keep fixing everything alone." She stood there holding the paper, feeling the fear behind those words. Derek had always tried to carry every problem by himself. Even as a child, he hated asking for help because he thought it made him look weak. Ruth wanted to call him, but she knew he might ask how she knew what he was going through. So she chose the only way she could reach him without revealing herself. She tore a clean corner from an unused notepad and wrote a short message in careful block letters so he would not recognize her handwriting. Resting does not mean you have given up. Even strong people need a moment to breathe. She placed the note beside his coffee cup, then stood there wondering whether she had gone too far. A janitor was supposed to clean the office, not leave personal messages for the CEO. Ruth almost took it back. Then she looked at the cold coffee, the pain medicine in his drawer, and the deep mark his head had left on the papers. She left the note where it was and quietly closed the door behind her. Derek found it the next morning. At first, he thought it came from his assistant, but she denied writing it. He asked 2 senior employees, and both looked confused. Embarrassed by his own curiosity, he waved it off and said it did not matter. But instead of throwing the note away, he folded it twice and placed it inside the top drawer of his desk. Later that afternoon, during a tense call with an investor, his hand moved toward the drawer without him noticing. He read the message again before returning to the call. The problem was still there, but for the first time in weeks, he did not feel completely alone inside it. Ruth left another note several nights later after hearing him coughing behind the glass wall. "Someone is hoping you make it home safely tonight. Please take care of yourself." This time, Derek did not ask anyone who had written it. He simply sat down and stared at the words. No one in his company spoke to him that way. They asked for approvals, decisions, money, and answers. They told him the company needed him to be stronger, faster, and more certain. Whoever was leaving the notes did not seem to want anything from him. That person only seemed worried about whether he was eating, sleeping, or getting home safely. The notes began appearing once or twice a week. They were never long and never dramatic. One reminded him to eat before drinking another cup of coffee. Another said that one failed deal did not erase everything he had built. On the night before a difficult board meeting, Ruth wrote, "You are more than the worst thing that happened this week." Derek read that one 3 times. Then he placed it with the others in his drawer. By the end of the month, there were 7 notes, all folded neatly and hidden beneath a stack of contracts. One evening, The board gave Derek 30 days to restore investor confidence or step away from leadership. He returned to his office after everyone had gone and sat in the dark, unable to look at the city. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine losing the company. Without it, he did not know who he would be or where he would go. He opened the drawer and spread the 7 notes across his desk. They were small pieces of paper, worth nothing to anyone else, yet they had become the only words he trusted. Somewhere inside the building was a person who still believed there was something in him worth saving. That night, Ruth found him gone, but saw the notes laid carefully across the desk. She realized he had kept every one. Her eyes filled with tears, and she covered her mouth to stop herself from making a sound. She wrote one more message and placed it in the center of the others. You do not have to hold the whole world up by yourself. Let someone stand beside you. It was a sentence she had often said when Derek was young, whenever he tried to hide his fear from her. The next morning, Derek read it and froze. He could not remember where he had heard those words before, but something about them felt familiar. For the first time, he stopped wondering which employee was leaving the notes and began wondering whether the person knew him long before he became successful. Yolanda had worked the night shift long enough to notice things most people missed. She knew which employees left food in the break room, which managers complained about dust no one else could see, and which offices were treated with more care than the job required. Ruth stood out from the beginning. She never rushed, never complained, and never left a task half-finished. But on the 41st floor, she became even more careful. She cleaned Derek's office slowly, almost gently, as if every object inside carried a memory. Yolanda noticed the straight books, the fresh flowers, and the coffee cup placed beside the machine before sunrise. She also noticed that Ruth sometimes stood outside the glass door for a few seconds before going in. At first, Yolanda assumed Ruth was trying to impress management. That idea quickly disappeared. Ruth never asked for praise, never mentioned how much extra work she did, and always left before the daytime staff arrived. When someone complimented the executive floor, Ruth only smiled and continued pushing her cart. She shared her lunch when another worker forgot theirs. She covered shifts for people with sick children. When a new janitor struggled with the equipment, Ruth stayed late to teach him how to use it without making him feel embarrassed. She treated everyone with the same quiet respect, whether they wore a cleaning uniform or an expensive suit. Over time, the crew stopped seeing her as the oldest worker on the team and began seeing her as the person they trusted most. Yolanda and Ruth often took their break together in the basement. The room was small, with 2 vending machines, a scratched table, and a microwave that made too much noise. Yolanda usually talked about her grandchildren, rising rent, or the buses that never arrived on time. Ruth listened closely and remembered every detail. She knew when Yolanda's granddaughter had a school play and when her son was waiting to hear back about a new job. But Ruth rarely spoke about her own family. Whenever someone asked if she had children, she would smile and say, "One son." Then she would change the subject before anyone could ask more. One night, Yolanda came to the executive floor earlier than usual and found Ruth standing inside Derek's office. Ruth was holding one of the framed photographs from the shelf. In the picture, Derek was a young boy, smiling beside a woman who looked much younger than Ruth but had the same eyes. Ruth quickly returned the frame to its place when she realized she was no longer alone. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Yolanda could have asked who the woman in the picture was. She could have asked why Ruth looked as though she had just been taken back to another life. Instead, she picked up a cloth and began wiping the other side of the shelf. From that night on, Yolanda started helping Ruth on the 41st floor. She never announced it and never asked permission. She simply rolled her cart out of the elevator at the same time and worked beside her. Some nights they talked quietly. Other nights they said almost nothing. Ruth seemed relieved by the company, even though she never explained why. When her back hurt, Yolanda took the heavier trash bags. When Yolanda's knees became sore, Ruth finished the restrooms. Their friendship grew through small acts that neither of them needed to name. A few weeks later, Yolanda noticed several folded notes hidden beneath a stack of papers on Derek's desk. She did not touch them, but she recognized Ruth's careful block letters. She looked toward Ruth, who was replacing a flower near the window. The tired woman moved with the care of someone preparing a room for a person she loved, not someone finishing a paid shift. Yolanda finally understood that whatever Ruth was hiding was not dangerous. It was painful, and it belonged to her. Before they left the office that night, Yolanda paused beside the glass door. She looked at the fresh cup near the coffee machine, the straightened photographs, and the small note waiting on the desk. Then she turned to Ruth and said, "Whoever sits in this office must be loved more than he knows." Ruth did not answer. Her hand tightened around the handle of her cart, and for a moment her eyes filled with tears. Then she gave Yolanda a small, grateful smile. It was not a confession, but it was enough. Yolanda understood that some truths should not be pulled from people before they are ready to give them. She reached for the elevator button, and the two women rode down together in silence. After that night, Yolanda watched Ruth more closely. She saw how Ruth hid her pain when she bent down, how she rested one hand against the wall when she thought no one was looking, and how the long shifts were beginning to wear down her body. Ruth had spent years protecting her secret, but Yolanda could see that keeping it was becoming harder. She did not know who Derek was to Ruth, but she knew one thing for certain. Sooner or later, love that deep would refuse to remain invisible. The accident happened 4 nights later, just before 2 in the morning. Ruth was cleaning the executive restroom while Yolanda worked in the pantry down the hall. Her hip had been bothering her for weeks, but she had told no one. Each time the pain returned, she would lean against the wall, wait for it to pass, and keep moving. That night, she was wiping the floor near the sink when her old work shoe slid across a wet patch of marble. She reached for the counter, but her hand caught only air. Her right hip struck the floor first, followed by her shoulder, and the side of her head hit the cabinet with a dull sound that echoed through the empty room. For several seconds, Ruth could not breathe. The pain spread from her hip into her back, sharp enough to make the ceiling blur above her. She tried to sit up, but her body would not obey. She pressed one palm against the cold floor and pushed again, biting her lip so hard she tasted blood. Her arm shook, then gave out beneath her. She fell back and closed her eyes, waiting for the pain to settle. What frightened her was not the possibility that she had broken something. It was the clock on the wall and the unfinished office at the end of the hallway. Yolanda found her 10 minutes later. She had noticed Ruth was not waiting beside the elevator at their usual time, so she went looking for her. When she opened the restroom door, Ruth was trying to pull herself up using the paper towel dispenser. Her face had turned pale, and sweat covered her forehead, even though the room was cold. Yolanda rushed to her side but did not try to lift her. "Don't move, Ruth. You may have broken your hip, and forcing yourself up could make it worse." Ruth shook her head and tried to reach for the wall again. "I cannot stay here, Yolanda," she said, her voice trembling from the pain. "His office is still unfinished. The coffee stain is still on the desk, and the reports are lying everywhere. He has an important meeting in the morning. He is already carrying more than anyone should have to carry. I don't want him to walk in and feel that even the one peaceful place he has left has fallen apart." Yolanda stared at her, unable to speak. Ruth was lying on a restroom floor, unable to move her leg, yet her first concern was still the man behind the glass office door. Yolanda placed one hand on Ruth's shoulder and said, "Listen to me. No clean desk is worth losing your ability to walk. Whoever that man is to you, he would not want you hurting yourself just to make his morning easier." Ruth looked toward the open doorway as if she could see all the way down the hall. Tears gathered in her eyes, but they were not caused only by the pain. "You don't understand," Ruth whispered. "I spent years waiting for him to come home, and then I spent years pretending I didn't mind when he stopped coming. Cleaning that room is the only way I still know how to take care of him. If I cannot finish it tonight, he will never know why it feels different in the morning. He will only know that something that was always there is suddenly gone." The words left Yolanda frozen beside her. She finally understood that Ruth's care was not admiration for a powerful employer. It was personal, old, and deep enough to make an injured woman think about an office before thinking about herself. Yolanda took out her phone and called their supervisor, Horace. Ruth reached weakly toward her arm and begged her not to do it. "Please don't let them take me away before his office is ready. He has been sleeping there again. There is a blanket on the couch, and the pain medicine is almost empty. Someone needs to leave him a clean cup and remind him to eat before he drinks more coffee." By the time Horace arrived, Ruth's entire body was shaking. He knelt beside her, took one look at her hip, and called an ambulance. Ruth protested, but he refused to cancel it. "You have spent every night taking care of a building full of people who do not even know your name," he told her. "Tonight, you are going to let someone take care of you." Ruth turned her face away, ashamed of the tears running down her cheeks. She had hidden pain for so long that being helped felt almost like being exposed. As they waited for the paramedics, 3 other cleaners gathered in the doorway. No one spoke. They had all seen Ruth work through back pain, fever, and exhaustion without asking anyone to lighten her load. Now they watched her clutch Yolanda's hand and stare toward Derek's office. "Promise me you will finish his room," Ruth said. "Straighten the photograph of the little boy on the shelf. He never notices when it leans, but I do. Put a fresh cup beside the coffee machine and leave a note telling him that one bad day does not mean his whole life is falling apart. Please make sure he doesn't feel alone when he comes in." Yolanda's eyes filled with tears. She squeezed Ruth's hand and answered, "I will finish everything exactly the way you would. But one day, Ruth, he needs to know that the peace he finds in that office did not appear by itself. He needs to know someone loved him enough to come here every night, even when that love was breaking her body." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. The pain had taken away her strength, but fear still remained in her eyes. "Not yet," she said softly. "If he finds out now, he may only feel guilty. I never came here to make him ashamed. I came because being near him was the closest thing I had to hearing him call me Mom again." No one in the doorway moved. The building above them carried Derek's name in bright silver letters, but the woman lying on its cold floor had asked for nothing from him, not recognition, not money, not even a thank you. She only wanted his morning to feel a little less heavy. When the paramedics arrived, Ruth finally allowed them to place her on the stretcher. As they wheeled her toward the service elevator, she kept looking back at the unfinished hallway until the doors closed. Yolanda stood in silence for several seconds after Ruth was gone. Then she picked up Ruth's cleaning cloth and walked toward the corner office. She straightened the photograph, cleaned the coffee stain, and placed a fresh cup beside the machine. But when she reached for a blank piece of paper to write the note Ruth had requested, her hand stopped. For the first time, Yolanda wondered whether protecting Ruth's secret was still an act of kindness, or whether it was helping Derek remain blind to the person who loved him most. Ruth had been in the emergency room for less than 20 minutes when she tried to leave. She was still wearing her Navy work uniform, one sleeve damp from the restroom floor, while an ice pack rested against her swollen hip. Every movement sent pain through her body, but she kept looking at the clock above the door. It was almost 3 in the morning. In a few hours, Derek would arrive at the office, and she could not stop thinking about the unfinished desk, the crooked photograph, and the empty space beside the coffee machine. When the nurse told her she needed an X-ray, Ruth reached for her shoes and said, "I have to go back. He has carried enough already. I cannot let the one place that feels safe to him look forgotten." Yolanda moved between Ruth and the door before she could stand. The moment Ruth placed her foot on the floor, her leg gave way and she dropped back into the chair. She gripped the armrest, trying not to cry out, but tears rose in her eyes anyway. The doctor warned that she might have a fracture, and that leaving could cause permanent damage. Ruth listened, yet her fear had nothing to do with the injury. For 3 years, cleaning Derek's office had been the only way she could still care for him. Missing one shift felt like losing the last small place she still had in his life. The nurse placed an emergency contact form on the table. Ruth stared at the blank line for a long time. She had left the same line empty when she first applied for the cleaning job because writing Derek's name would have exposed everything. If the hospital called him, he would learn that his mother had spent 3 years cleaning his office without asking for money, recognition, or even a conversation. She imagined his shock, followed by guilt, and that was what she had always wanted to spare him. Ruth held the pen, but her hand trembled so badly that she could not write. Yolanda sat beside her and gently covered Ruth's hand with her own. "You have spent years making sure he never felt alone," she said, "but you have been carrying all the loneliness by yourself." Ruth lowered her head. The truth she had protected through 1,000 nights suddenly felt too heavy to hold any longer. Horace stood near the wall, waiting without pushing her. The room grew quiet, except for the soft sound of Ruth trying to steady her breathing. Finally, Ruth placed the pen on the table. "The man whose office I clean is my son," she said. "Derek Gaines owns that building." No one moved. The nurse stopped writing. Horace stared at Ruth as if the words could not possibly belong together. Yolanda closed her eyes for a moment because the photograph, the notes, and the care Ruth gave that office now made painful sense. Ruth did not try to defend herself or explain every year of silence. She only looked down at her rough hands and said, "I never needed his money. I only missed being his mother." The words broke the last of her strength. Ruth began to cry, quietly at first, then with the tired grief of someone who had spent too long pretending that being close from a distance was enough. Yolanda put her arms around her, careful not to touch the injured hip. Ruth leaned against her and finally allowed herself to be held. For the first time in 3 years, she was no longer protecting the secret alone. Ruth agreed to stay for the X-ray only after Yolanda promised to return to the tower and finish Derek's office before morning. Horace promised not to reveal the truth until Ruth was ready. But as Yolanda drove back through the dark streets, one thought would not leave her. Derek had an entire company ready to answer whenever he called, yet his own mother had been too afraid to write his name on an emergency form. By the time Yolanda entered the lobby, she was no longer sure that keeping Ruth's secret was an act of love. She began to wonder whether someone had to make Derek see the woman he had failed to notice. Derek knew something was wrong before he could explain what it was. He entered his office shortly after 7 that morning, placed his briefcase beside the desk, and reached toward the coffee machine without looking. The clean cup that usually waited beside it was not there. He opened the cabinet, took one out, and told himself it meant nothing. Then he noticed a dark coffee ring near the edge of his desk, left from the night before. The books behind his chair were slightly uneven, and one of the framed photographs leaned toward the wall. Near the window, 2 flowers had begun to wilt. None of these things were serious, yet together they made the office feel strangely empty. Derek tried to begin his day as usual. He opened his laptop, reviewed the morning reports, and answered 3 emails, but his eyes kept returning to the small things around him. The room was clean enough. The trash had been emptied, and the floor had been vacuumed. Still, it did not feel cared for. Until that morning, he had never realized there was a difference. He had assumed the flowers replaced themselves, the photographs always stood straight, and the cup beside the machine was simply part of the office. Now, for the first time, he understood that someone had been paying attention to details he had never even noticed. He walked to the bookshelf and straightened the photograph with his own hand. It was the old picture of him as a child, standing beside his mother in their front yard. He was holding a plastic baseball bat and smiling with 2 missing teeth. Ruth looked young in the photograph, one arm wrapped tightly around him, as if she could protect him from everything in the world. Derek stared at her face longer than he had in years. He remembered how she used to enter his bedroom after he fell asleep, pick his clothes off the floor, arrange his school books, and leave a glass of water beside his bed. He had always woken to find everything in its place without thinking about the hands that had put it there. A quiet discomfort settled in his chest. He opened the top drawer of his desk and looked at the anonymous notes he had saved. There were 8 of them now, folded neatly beneath his contracts. The newest message told him that he did not have to carry the whole world alone. He ran his thumb across the edge of the paper, thinking again about how familiar those words had felt. The office around him suddenly seemed connected to the notes, the clean cup, the straight books, the fresh flowers, and the gentle reminders to rest. What he had treated as separate conveniences now felt like pieces of the same person. His assistant entered with the schedule for the day and began listing meetings, but Derek barely heard her. He looked once more at the wilted flowers and interrupted her. "Who usually takes care of my office at night?" She stopped in the middle of a sentence. In all the years she had worked for him, Derek had never asked about the cleaning staff. She explained that an outside company handled the building overnight, but she did not know the name of the person assigned to his floor. Derek looked down at the coffee stain and felt embarrassed by how little he knew. Someone had entered his office every night, learned his habits, noticed when he was struggling, and left words that helped him through the worst month of his career. Yet, he had never once asked who that person was. "Find out who normally cleans this room," he said. "I want to know their name." His assistant nodded and left, surprised by the seriousness in his voice. Derek remained beside the bookshelf, holding the childhood photograph in both hands. He thought about calling his mother, but the familiar fear stopped him. Too much time had passed. He would have to explain why he had ignored her calls and why every promise to visit had become another excuse. He placed the photograph back on the shelf and adjusted it until it faced directly toward his desk. Then he opened his phone and found Ruth's number. His thumb rested above the call button, but once again, he could not press it. Across town, Ruth lay in a hospital bed waiting for the results of her X-ray. Her work shoes were in a plastic bag beneath the chair, and her navy uniform had been folded beside her. She kept asking Yolanda whether the office had been finished before morning. Yolanda assured her that it had, but she did not mention the missing cup, the wilted flowers, or the photograph she had purposely left slightly crooked. She had cleaned the room, but she had not copied every small act Ruth performed out of love. Yolanda wanted Derek to feel the difference. She wanted him to understand that someone had been there all along. Back in the tower, Derek tried to focus on his first meeting, but the office no longer felt like a place built only for business. Everywhere he looked, he saw signs of an invisible person he had taken for granted. By noon, his assistant returned and explained that the regular janitor had been injured during the night. Derek's hand stopped above his keyboard. He looked at the empty space beside the coffee machine and felt an unexpected fear move through him. Then, his assistant placed a request with the cleaning company and waited for the worker's name. Yolanda returned to the hospital after sunrise and found Ruth awake, still asking about Derek's office. The X-ray showed a small fracture near her hip, and the doctor had ordered several weeks of rest. Ruth listened without arguing, but Yolanda could see that her mind was somewhere else. She worried about the cup beside the coffee machine, the flowers near the window, and whether Derek had found the final note. Even after the fall, she was still thinking about making his day easier. Yolanda sat beside the bed and watched Ruth hold the edge of the blanket with the same hands that had cleaned her son's office for 3 years. In that moment, she understood that Ruth would return to work the second her body allowed it, even if the job eventually broke her. Before leaving, Yolanda noticed Ruth's employee badge inside the clear bag that held her uniform. The small photograph showed Ruth wearing a quiet smile, her gray hair neatly combed, and her eyes warm despite the plain background. Yolanda picked it up and thought about the promise she had made. She had told Ruth that the secret would remain safe until she was ready. But Ruth might never be ready. She had spent years protecting Derek from guilt while accepting every piece of pain herself. Keeping silent no longer felt like loyalty. It felt like helping a mother disappear. That evening, Yolanda carried the badge back to the tower. She could have called the CEO's office, but she knew Ruth would never forgive a public confrontation. She could have told Horace to report the truth, but then the story would pass through managers, lawyers, and company records before reaching Derek. Ruth deserved better than becoming office gossip. So Yolanda chose the quietest path she could find. Near the end of the shift, she walked into the lobby and placed the badge face up on the reception counter, directly beneath the morning lights. She left no note and gave no explanation. She simply placed Ruth's face where her son could finally see it. Yolanda stood there for a moment before walking away. "I'm sorry, Ruth," she whispered, "but loving him should not cost you the rest of your life." Then she entered the service elevator and let the doors close behind her. For the next hour, the badge remained alone on the marble counter while the building slowly changed from night to day. Security guards switched shifts, lobby lights grew brighter. Employees began arriving with coffee in their hands and phones against their ears. Several people glanced at the badge, but no one stopped long enough to study the woman in the photograph. Derek entered the lobby shortly after 7. He had slept less than 2 hours and was already reading an email about the upcoming board vote. His assistant met him near the elevator and handed him a cup of coffee along with his morning schedule. As they walked, she mentioned that someone from the cleaning crew had left an employee badge at reception. Derek barely looked up. On any other morning, he would have told her to send it back to the contractor. But he had spent the previous day wondering about the injured janitor and the office that suddenly felt empty. He turned toward the counter. At first, all he saw was a blue cleaning company logo and a small photograph beneath it. Then his steps slowed. The woman in the picture had short gray hair and wore a navy uniform. Her face looked older than the one he remembered, but her eyes had not changed. He knew those eyes from across the breakfast table, from the school parking lot, and from the front row at every basketball game he had ever played. They were the eyes that watched him leave for college and tried not to cry. They were the eyes he had avoided thinking about every Sunday when the reminder on his phone told him to call home. Derek reached for the badge with a shaking hand. Beneath the photograph was the name Ruth Arlene, with no last name. Below it were the words night custodial staff and a start date from 3 years earlier. He read each line once, then again, as if repeating the words might turn them into something else. His mother had been working in his building, not visiting, not attending an event, cleaning it, for 3 years. The lobby continued moving around him, but Derek heard nothing. Employees passed through the security gates, elevator doors opened and closed. Someone greeted him, but he did not answer. His mind returned to every morning he had entered a perfect office without asking who had been there before him. The straight books, the fresh flowers, the cup beside the coffee machine, the childhood photograph turned toward his desk. Then he remembered the anonymous notes hidden in his drawer, especially the words that had felt so familiar. You do not have to hold the whole world up by yourself. Let someone stand beside you. He understood. His mother had seen him falling apart. She had watched him sleep at his desk, heard him coughing, cleaned around the medicine bottles, and left him the words he had needed when no one else noticed he was struggling. She had been close enough to touch the same objects he touched, yet he had not called her in months. She had found a way to remain his mother without asking him for anything. Derek pressed the badge against his chest as the full weight of it finally reached him. His knees gave out. He caught the edge of the reception counter, but could not remain standing. Slowly, the man who owned the building lowered himself onto the marble floor his mother had cleaned night after night. His assistant rushed toward him, asking whether he needed medical help, but Derek could not answer. He looked down at Ruth's photograph and saw the quiet smile she had carried into his building while he remained too busy to notice her. For the first time in years, he did not care who was watching him. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely steady enough to form the words. Find her. I don't care what meeting you cancel or who you have to call. Please find my mother." His assistant took the badge and hurried toward the elevator. Derek remained on the lobby floor, staring at his empty hands. He had spent his entire life believing success meant building something large enough for the world to see. Now, he understood that the person who loved him most had been inside that success every night, wearing a uniform with no last name, waiting for him to look down. And somewhere across the city, Ruth lay in a hospital bed, still believing her secret was safe. Derek remained on the lobby floor long after his assistant had gone to make the calls. Ruth's badge was pressed between both of his hands, but he could barely feel it. His chest tightened, and every breath stopped before it felt complete. People slowed down as they passed, yet no one dared approach the man they had always seen, standing tall and in control. Derek did not cry. The shock was still too deep for tears. He simply stared at his mother's photograph and tried to understand how the woman who had raised him could have worked inside his building for 3 years without him knowing. Then the memories came, one after another. He saw himself at 6 years old, standing beside his first bicycle, while Ruth held the back of the seat and ran behind him. When he finally rode alone, he had turned around expecting her to be gone, but she was still there, cheering from the middle of the street. He remembered falling a few seconds later and scraping both knees. Ruth had carried him home, cleaned the blood, and told him that falling did not mean he had failed. She had spent her whole life teaching him how to get back up, yet when age and loneliness finally brought her down, he had not even known she had fallen. Another memory followed. Derek was 14, sitting on the bench during his first high school basketball game because the coach did not think he was ready. He had been too embarrassed to look toward the stands until he heard one voice calling his name. Ruth was standing alone in the front row, clapping as if he had scored the winning basket. Years later, when he finally became a starter, she attended every game after working long shifts at the hospital. Even when she was tired, she never let him look into the crowd and find an empty seat. Derek looked around the lobby now and realized that when Ruth had needed him, the seat meant for her son had been empty for years. He remembered graduation morning next. Ruth had ironed his shirt twice because she wanted every fold to be perfect. She had taken more pictures than he thought necessary and cried before his name was even called. After the ceremony, she held his face in both hands and told him, "No matter how far life takes you, never become too busy to remember where you were loved first." At the time, Derek had smiled and promised he never would. Now, he was sitting on a floor she had cleaned, holding proof that he had broken that promise more completely than he could have imagined. His assistant returned and knelt beside him. She had spoken with the cleaning company and the hospital. Ruth had fractured her hip, but she had refused to remain overnight after the doctors confirmed she could recover at home with rest. She had been discharged less than an hour earlier, and Yolanda had driven her back to the house in Decatur. Derek closed his eyes when he heard the address. It was the same small house where he had learned to ride a bicycle, practiced jump shots in the driveway, and stayed up late studying at the kitchen table. He knew the address by heart, yet he had not driven there in more than a year. His assistant began mentioning the board meeting scheduled for that morning, but Derek slowly raised his hand. For once, the company would have to wait. He looked at Ruth's badge again and spoke in a voice that barely sounded like his own. "Cancel everything. I have already missed too much." There was no anger in the words, only the painful clarity of a man who had finally understood the true cost of his choices. He stood carefully, placed the badge inside his jacket pocket, and walked out of the building without looking back. The drive to Decatur should have taken 20 minutes, but it felt longer than every business trip Derek had ever made. He passed the restaurant where Ruth used to take him on his birthday, the pharmacy where she bought medicine when he had the flu, and the corner store where she once counted coins to buy him a new notebook for school. These places had always seemed small and ordinary to him. Now each one held a piece of the life she had built around him. He realized she had never loved him through expensive things. She had loved him through packed lunches, late-night rides, clean clothes, saved seats, and porch lights left on after dark. At a red light, Derek opened his phone and found the record of his mother's calls. One after another, they appeared on the screen, missed, unanswered, ignored. He remembered seeing them during meetings, dinners, and airport delays. Each time, he had told himself he would call when life became less busy. But life had never slowed down, and his mother had stopped asking for his time. Instead, she had taken a night job just to be close enough to straighten his photograph and leave a clean cup beside his coffee machine. Derek gripped the steering wheel and finally began to cry. The tears came without warning and made the road blur in front of him. He pulled over beneath a row of old oak trees and lowered his head against the steering wheel. He did not cry because his mother had worked as a janitor. He cried because she had believed that hiding in his building was the only way she could remain part of his life. Every important day he could remember had Ruth standing somewhere nearby, watching, waiting, and believing in him. But when her days became quiet and her body became weaker, he had not been there at all. After several minutes, Derek wiped his face and continued driving. When he turned onto the street where he had grown up, the houses looked smaller than he remembered, but almost nothing else had changed. The old gate still leaned slightly to one side, the oak branches still met above the road, and the porch light at Ruth's house was still on, even though morning sunlight already filled the yard. She had always left that light burning whenever she expected him home. Derek stopped the car across from the house but did not get out. For years, he had walked into rooms filled with powerful people and never struggled to find the right words. Now, facing one small front door, he had none. An apology felt too small. An explanation would sound like another excuse. He placed his hand over the badge inside his pocket and understood that there was only one thing left to do. He had to walk to the door and finally show up for the woman who had never stopped showing up for him. Derek sat across from the house where he had grown up, unable to open the car door. The porch looked almost the same as it had when he was a boy, but a new handrail had been added beside the steps. He immediately thought of Ruth's injured hip and felt his chest tighten. The porch light was still on, even though the morning sun had already filled the street. His mother had always left it burning whenever she thought he might come home late. Derek used to tell her she was wasting electricity. Ruth always answered that no child should return to a dark house. He finally stepped out of the car and walked toward the door. Inside his jacket pocket was the employee badge that had changed everything he believed about the last 3 years. Through the window, he could see the hallway covered with photographs of his childhood. There he was, with his first bicycle, in his basketball uniform, and wearing his graduation cap. Ruth had saved every version of him while he had become too busy to notice the years changing her. Derek raised his hand to knock, but it remained frozen in the air. He had spoken before investors, judges, and crowded rooms without fear, yet he did not know how to face the one person who had never asked him to prove anything. He knocked softly. After a long moment, he heard slow footsteps and the scrape of a walker against the floor. The sound hurt more than he expected. He wanted to enter and help her, but he stayed outside because it no longer felt like his right to walk in without being invited. The lock turned and the door opened halfway. Ruth stood behind it in a plain blouse and house slippers, one hand gripping the walker. Her face looked tired, her fingers were swollen, and she was carefully keeping her weight off one leg. Mother and son looked at each other without speaking. Derek had prepared apologies during the drive, but they disappeared when he saw her. Ruth did not ask where he had been. She did not mention the unanswered calls, the hospital, or the 3 years she had spent cleaning his office. Her eyes moved slowly across his face, checking him the way she had when he was a child. Even after everything, her first concern was whether he looked tired or sick. Then she noticed him staring at the bruises on her wrist and quietly pulled down her sleeve, still trying to protect him from feeling guilty. The silence held everything neither of them knew how to say. Derek wished she would become angry. Anger would give him something to answer and perhaps a punishment he could accept. Instead, Ruth opened the door wider and asked, "Have you eaten anything today?" Derek lowered his head. That simple question broke through him more deeply than blame ever could. It was the same thing she had asked after school, after basketball practice, and whenever he came home from college with an empty wallet. Her hair had turned gray, her body had become weaker, and years of work had changed her hands. But the way she loved him had remained exactly the same. He shook his head because his voice still would not come. "There is soup on the stove," Ruth said. "Come inside before it gets cold." Derek stepped through the doorway. The house smelled like chicken soup and cornbread. His old coat hook was still beside the door, and the living room table still held the telephone Ruth had waited beside every Sunday. A cup of tea sat next to it, untouched and cold. He looked at the empty chair and imagined her sitting there week after week, telling herself he was simply busy. Ruth began moving toward the kitchen with the walker, and Derek reached out to help her, but stopped, unsure whether she wanted him near. Ruth noticed his hesitation and held out her hand. Derek took it carefully. Her palm was rough, marked by the mop she had pushed through his building every night. Those same hands had once tied his shoes, packed his lunches, and wiped tears from his face. Now he held them as if they might break. Ruth squeezed his fingers gently and led him toward the kitchen. 2 bowls were already on the table. Derek did not know whether she always prepared an extra place or whether she had somehow believed he would return. Ruth sat down slowly and poured soup into his bowl. She placed a piece of cornbread beside it, then waited for him to eat. For a few moments, they were not a billionaire and a janitor. They were simply a mother and son sitting at the same kitchen table again. Derek could not lift the spoon. He reached into his jacket, removed the badge, and placed it between them. Ruth looked down at her photograph and became very still. She did not appear surprised. She had always known the secret would eventually end. She had only hoped to choose the moment herself. Derek stared at the words, "Night Custodial Staff," then looked at his mother's injured hands. "Mom," he whispered. It was the only word he could manage. Ruth reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. She did not offer an explanation or an easy forgiveness. She simply stayed there, giving him the time he had failed to give her. Derek looked into her eyes and understood that he could no longer hide behind work, guilt, or another promise to call later. The truth was sitting between them, printed on a small plastic badge, and now he had to ask the question he was most afraid to hear answered. Derek kept his eyes on the badge between them. For years, he had handled difficult conversations by preparing facts, numbers, and answers in advance. None of that helped him now. Across the table sat the woman who had given him everything without ever asking him to repay it, and he could not understand why she had chosen to suffer in silence. He turned the badge over, then looked at the swelling in her hands. "Why did you do this, Mom?" he finally asked. "Why would you clean my office every night instead of telling me you were there?" Ruth did not answer right away. She picked up his bowl and moved it slightly closer to him, as though the soup becoming cold still mattered. Then she folded her hands in her lap. "I tried calling," she said. "At first I told myself you were busy. Then the weeks became months, and every time I thought about asking you to come home, I worried it would sound like another demand on your time." She looked toward the old telephone in the living room. "I did not want you to visit because you felt guilty. I wanted you to come because you missed me." Derek lowered his eyes. He remembered every call he had silenced during a meeting and every Sunday reminder he had dismissed. In his mind, each one had been a small delay. He had never imagined that on the other end of those missed calls, Ruth was sitting beside a cup of tea, waiting for a voice that never came. "You should have told me," he said, but the words sounded weak the moment they left him. Ruth looked at him without anger. "And what would I have said? That your mother needed an appointment to see you? That I was lonely in the house where I raised you? I was afraid you would promise to visit, and I would spend another year waiting for that promise." The truth hurt because Derek knew she was right. He had made promises before. He had said he would call after the next deal, come home after the next trip, and make more time when the company became stable. There had always been another reason to wait. Ruth had finally stopped asking, not because she needed him less, but because every unanswered hope had become harder to carry. He reached for her hand, but hesitated when he saw the calluses across her palm. "So you took a cleaning job just to be near me?" Ruth nodded. "Watching you from a distance hurt less than lying awake and wondering if you were all right." Her voice stayed calm, but tears gathered in her eyes. "At the office, I could see whether you had eaten. I could tell when you had slept at your desk or when the medicine in your drawer was running low. I could straighten your picture, leave you a clean cup, and make sure you started the morning with one small thing already taken care of." She paused and looked down at their hands. "It was not the same as having my son home. But for a little while each night, I still felt like his mother." Derek could no longer look at her. He thought of all the mornings he had entered that perfect office without noticing the love behind it. He had believed the room simply stayed clean, the flowers remained fresh, and the notes appeared from someone who admired him. Ruth had been there after midnight, caring for him in the only way he had left open to her. While he slept in a penthouse too large for one person, his mother pushed a cart through his building so she could feel close to him. "I sent you money every month," he whispered, ashamed of how empty the sentence sounded. "I know," Ruth said. "It always arrived on time." There was no bitterness in her voice, which made the words hurt even more. Derek had treated the automatic deposit as proof that he was a good son. He had confused providing money with being present. Ruth gently turned his hand over and ran her thumb across his knuckles, the same way she used to when he was young and frightened. "The money paid the bills," she said, "but it could not sit at this table. It could not ask me how my day went. It could not laugh at one of my stories or tell me it would call again tomorrow." Derek's face tightened. "What did you want from me?" Ruth looked directly into his eyes. "One ordinary conversation." Her tears finally fell, but she did not wipe them away. "I wanted you to call without checking the time. I wanted to hear you complain about traffic, tell me what you had for lunch, or ask whether the tomatoes in the yard were growing. I did not need another house or another dollar. I only wanted 10 minutes in which I was your mother again, not another responsibility waiting on your calendar." Something inside Derek gave way. He had spent years believing the important moments of life had to be large: a successful deal, a new building, a magazine cover, a room full of applause. Ruth had wanted none of those things from him. She had wanted a phone call about nothing, a meal without an agenda, a few minutes in which he was not a CEO and she did not have to hide behind a cleaning cart. He covered his face with both hands, but he could not stop the tears. "I made you feel like you had to disappear just to be close to me," he said. His voice broke as he looked at her uniform badge. "You were inside my building for 3 years, and I never once asked who cleaned my office. I walked past people every morning without knowing their names. I did the same thing to my own mother." Ruth reached across the table and pulled his hands away from his face. "I did not come there to punish you," she said. "I came because I missed you. I kept the secret because I knew that if you discovered me too soon, guilt would bring you home. I did not want guilt sitting in that chair. I wanted my son." Derek stood and walked around the table. He lowered himself beside her chair, careful of her injured leg, and rested his head against her lap. For a moment, he was no longer 42 years old. He was the boy who had fallen from his bicycle, lost a basketball game, and feared he would never become anything. Ruth placed one hand on the back of his head and slowly ran her fingers through his hair. It was the same gentle motion she had used when he was sick or afraid. He cried without trying to hide it, finally allowing himself to be held by the person he should have turned to long ago. "I'm sorry," he said. "I kept telling myself I would come back when life slowed down. I did not understand that while I was waiting, you were growing older without me." Ruth's hand paused against his hair. "Then do not promise me another day," she said. "Just stay today." Derek looked up at her. There were years he could not return, and Sundays he could not repair, but she was still offering him something more valuable than forgiveness. She was offering him the present moment. He stood, pulled the empty chair closer to hers, and sat beside his mother. Then he picked up the spoon and tasted the soup she had made while injured, still believing he might need to be fed. Ruth watched him take the first bite. "It needs salt," she said quietly. Derek shook his head as tears returned to his eyes. "It tastes like home." For the first time in years, neither of them looked at the clock. The soup grew cold as they spoke about small things, the garden, an old neighbor, the leaking kitchen faucet, and the candy Derek still kept in his desk. It was not the dramatic reunion either of them might have imagined. It was something better, the ordinary conversation Ruth had waited years to have. Yet as Derek listened to his mother laugh softly across the table, one painful question remained. Loving her from that moment forward would be easy. Facing what his neglect had cost her and deciding what he would do about it would be much harder. Derek tried to keep eating, but his attention stayed on Ruth's hands. She held the spoon carefully because her fingers were stiff and swollen. Across her palms were thick calluses he had never seen before, and a small cut near her thumb had been covered with an old bandage. These were the hands that had gripped a mop through thousands of hours while he sat upstairs signing contracts. He reached across the table and gently turned one of them over. Ruth tried to pull away, embarrassed, but Derek held on as if letting go would mean losing another part of her. Memories came back through the touch of her skin. Those hands had once held his tiny fingers as he learned to walk across the living room floor. They had tied his shoes before school, checked his forehead when he was sick, and covered his ears during thunderstorms. When he fell from his bicycle, those hands cleaned the blood from his knees. When he could not sleep before his first basketball game, they rubbed his back until morning. Derek had spent his life remembering the things his mother did for him, but he had never stopped to think about the hands that did them. He looked at the deep marks across her palm and imagined her pushing the cleaning cart through his dark building. He saw her carrying trash bags, bending over cold floors, and hiding in stairwells whenever his elevator arrived. She had been growing older only a few feet away from him, and he had never looked closely enough to see it. He had paid strangers to manage his schedule, prepare his meals, and drive his car, yet his mother had worked through the night just to leave him a clean cup. The truth was no longer something he could understand with his mind. It entered his body all at once, and the strong, controlled man everyone knew disappeared. Derek lowered his head onto Ruth's hands and began to cry. It was not the quiet crying of someone trying to remain dignified. His shoulders shook, his breathing broke, and years of pressure came out of him without permission. He cried for the unanswered calls, the empty Sundays, and every family dinner he had replaced with another meeting. He cried because his mother had been close enough to hear him cough, but believed she had to remain hidden. Most of all, he cried because she had asked for so little, and even that had seemed too difficult for him to give. Ruth moved carefully from her chair and placed one hand on the back of his head. Her injured hip made every step painful, but she stood beside him anyway. She stroked his hair with the same slow motion she had used when he was a boy. Derek wrapped both arms around her waist and held on, afraid that if he loosened his grip, time would begin moving again. Ruth did not tell him to stop crying or assure him that everything was fine. She simply stayed with him until he could breathe. "I thought taking care of the bills meant I was taking care of you," Derek finally said. "I never asked whether you were lonely." Ruth rested her cheek against his head. "You were trying to build a life," she said. "You just forgot that a life needs people inside it." The words were gentle, but Derek felt them deeply. He had built offices, apartment towers, and a home overlooking the city, yet none of those places had made him feel as safe as this small kitchen. His company knew his habits, his preferences, and the value of his time. Ruth knew when he was pretending to be strong. She knew he still liked caramel candy, drank coffee before eating, and held his breath when he was frightened. The world knew the man he had become, but his mother still remembered the child underneath. Derek helped Ruth sit down, then brought a bowl of warm water and a clean towel from the sink. He placed her hand inside the water and gently removed the worn bandage from her thumb. Ruth watched him struggle with the small task, remembering how impatient he had been whenever she cleaned his childhood cuts. Now he moved slowly, afraid of hurting her. He applied ointment from the kitchen cabinet and wrapped a fresh bandage around her finger. It was the first thing he had done for her in a long time that could not be completed by sending money. When he finished, Derek kept holding her hand. He noticed a faint scar near her wrist and remembered getting lost in a crowded store when he was 5. Ruth had found him crying beside a shelf and held him so tightly that he complained he could not breathe. For years, he had believed he was the one who had been lost that day. Now, he understood that his mother had probably been even more frightened. She had spent her entire life finding him whenever he wandered too far. This time, she had entered his building because she did not know another way to bring him home. Derek looked around the kitchen and noticed how little had changed. The table was scratched, the faucet still leaked, and an old family calendar hung beside the refrigerator. Several dates had small handwritten reminders, but one note appeared again and again. Call Derek. Some dates had been crossed out, others had remained untouched. Ruth saw him looking and quietly closed the calendar, but it was too late. He had already seen how many times she had planned to reach for him and decided not to. He took her rough hands between his own. "I cannot give you those years back," he said, "but I will not make you wait for me again." Ruth looked at him with love, but also with the caution of someone who had heard promises before. "Do not promise me forever today," she answered. "Come back tomorrow, then come back the day after that." Derek nodded. He understood that forgiveness would not be earned through one emotional morning. It would be built through ordinary days, returned phone calls, shared meals, and time that no longer had to compete with his calendar. He kissed the center of her palm, directly over the calluses left by the mop handle. Ruth closed her fingers around his hand, and for a moment they sat quietly at the table like they had when he was young. Then Derek noticed an old framed certificate, partly hidden behind a stack of mail near the kitchen counter. It carried Ruth's name and the seal of a nursing program she had completed years earlier. Beside it was a faded photograph of her wearing hospital scrubs, standing outside a small community clinic with a group of children. Derek picked it up and saw a version of his mother he barely remembered, a woman with her own work, her own pride, and dreams that had existed before his needs filled her life. He looked from the photograph to Ruth and realized there was still one important question he had never asked. What had she given up so that he could become the man he was? Derek held the old photograph of Ruth outside the community clinic and studied the woman she had been before her life became centered around him. She wore light blue scrubs, and her smile looked confident and full of purpose. In the picture, several children stood around her while an older doctor held a pair of keys. Derek realized he knew almost nothing about that part of her life. He knew she had worked long shifts when he was young, but he had never asked what she wanted for herself. All his childhood memories began with what she had done for him. None of them included the dreams she had put aside. He placed the photograph on the table and sat beside her. "What did you want before taking care of me became your whole life?" he asked. Ruth looked at the picture, then smiled as if she had not allowed herself to think about the answer in years. She told him that she once dreamed of opening a small neighborhood clinic. It would be a place where people could see a doctor without choosing between medical care and rent. She wanted working mothers to bring in sick children after their shifts, and she wanted older people to receive medicine without feeling ashamed that they could not afford it. She had even saved money and found a small building, but after Derek's father died, every dollar and every free hour went toward keeping their family together. Ruth did not speak with regret. She explained that raising Derek had been a choice she would make again. Still, there were nights when she passed the empty building she once hoped to rent and wondered what might have happened if life had been different. Years later, working as a janitor brought that old dream back to her. She met people who cleaned expensive offices but delayed seeing doctors because they had no insurance. Yolanda worked through knee pain for months. Another cleaner ignored a serious tooth infection because treatment cost more than his monthly rent. Ruth began carrying pain medicine, bandages, and small first aid supplies in her locker because sometimes she was the closest thing the night crew had to a nurse. Derek listened without interrupting. He had spent years giving money to large charities because the donations looked responsible in annual reports. Yet the people cleaning his own building had been getting sick in silence only a few floors below him. His mother had seen their pain because she worked beside them, ate with them, and learned their names. He had seen only a clean building each morning. The difference shamed him, but Ruth had already taught him that shame was useless unless it led to change. "I cannot return the years you gave up for me," Derek said, "but maybe the dream does not have to stay buried with them." Ruth shook her head. She did not want him to build something out of guilt or turn their private pain into a public story. Derek understood. He promised there would be no building with his name on it, no cameras at the opening, and no speech about a billionaire helping the poor. If the clinic was built, it would belong to the people who needed it. It would offer free basic care, prescriptions, dental services, mental health support, and evening appointments for workers who could not leave their jobs during the day. Most importantly, Ruth would help decide how it operated. Over the next few months, Derek began showing up differently. He visited his mother after work instead of sending a driver. He attended meetings with nurses, local doctors, janitors, and families from the neighborhood. For the first time, he sat in rooms without taking the most important seat. He listened as workers described hiding injuries because they feared losing their shifts. He learned how many people went to work sick because missing one day meant missing groceries. The numbers were painful, but the stories changed him more. Ruth chose an empty building only a few blocks from her home. It had once been a grocery store and needed major repairs, but she loved that it was close to the bus line. She wanted people to reach it without owning a car. Derek offered larger and newer locations, but Ruth refused them. "A clinic is only useful when the people who need it can get through the door," she told him. That sentence became the rule behind every decision they made. They named it the Arlene Community Care Center, using Ruth's middle name rather than the family name already written across office towers. Yolanda became the worker outreach director, helping cleaning crews understand which services were available. Horace helped create a program allowing injured employees to receive treatment without losing their shifts. Local nurses joined the clinic because they trusted Ruth's vision. Derek funded the building in its first years of operation, but he refused to place his name on the entrance. On opening morning, Ruth arrived using a cane. Her hip was healing, though she still moved carefully. The waiting room was already full of families, older workers, and members of the night crew. A janitor Derek recognized from his own building sat near the front with a swollen hand he had been hiding for weeks. Yolanda stood beside him, smiling through tears. There were no reporters and no ribbon held by city officials. Ruth simply unlocked the front door and stepped aside so the patients could enter first. Derek watched his mother greet each person by name. She was no longer wearing a Navy janitor's uniform, but she did not look uncomfortable or out of place. She looked like the woman in the old photograph, older, slower, yet finally standing inside the dream she had once given up. When the first child entered with his mother, Ruth bent carefully and welcomed him. The boy reached for her hand without hesitation. Derek looked at the calluses still visible on her palm and understood that those hands had not been ruined by sacrifice. They had carried love from one life into another. Later that evening, after the clinic closed, Derek found Ruth alone in an examination room, folding clean blankets. He reminded her that employees had been hired to do that work. Ruth smiled and continued folding. Some habits, she explained, came from caring too long to simply stop. Derek took the blanket from her and folded the next one beside her. "Is this close to the clinic you dreamed about?" he asked. Ruth looked through the doorway at the quiet waiting room. "No," she said. "It is better. The first dream was only mine. This one belongs to all of us." Derek placed the folded blanket on the shelf and looked at the small sign beside the door. "No one will be turned away because they cannot pay." For most of his life, he had believed a legacy was something large enough to carry his name. His mother showed him that a real legacy could be a door left open for people who had nowhere else to go. That night, Derek drove Ruth home. Before leaving, he put a reminder in his phone for dinner the following evening. Then, he removed the old weekly reminder that said, "Call Mom." He no longer needed a notification to remember her. The next chapter of their lives would not be built through one grand apology or one expensive gift. It would be built at the kitchen table, one ordinary evening at a time. The clinic changed many lives, but the biggest change happened in Ruth's small kitchen. Derek began coming home for dinner almost every evening. Some nights he arrived at 6, other nights traffic or work kept him until 8. But he came, and Ruth no longer had to sit beside the telephone, wondering whether he remembered her. She would hear his car outside, then the front door opening, followed by the same familiar words. "Mom, I'm home." Every time, Ruth looked up from the stove with a smile that made him understand how much those 3 simple words meant. Derek made one rule for their dinners. His phone stayed inside a drawer near the front door. No calls, no messages, and no meetings were allowed at the table. At first, his hand kept reaching toward his empty pocket whenever the phone buzzed in the next room. Ruth noticed, but said nothing. She simply continued telling him about the clinic, the neighbors, or a recipe she wanted to try. Slowly, the urge to check his phone became weaker. Derek learned that most business problems could wait an hour. The years he had lost with his mother could not. Their conversations were rarely important in the way Derek once measured importance. Ruth told him that the tomatoes in her yard were finally growing. Derek complained about a traffic jam that had made him late. They argued about whether he needed another serving of cornbread. She reminded him to wear a coat when the weather turned cold, even though he was 42 years old. Sometimes they laughed about mistakes he had made as a child. Other nights, they sat quietly and ate without needing to fill every second. Derek discovered that peace did not always come from solving a problem. Sometimes it came from knowing the person across the table would still be there when you looked up. He also began noticing things he had ignored before. Ruth became tired more quickly than she used to. She sometimes forgot where she had placed her glasses and needed both hands to lift a heavy pot. Derek started arriving early enough to help with dinner. At first, Ruth tried to push him out of the kitchen, saying he would only make a mess. He stayed anyway. He washed vegetables, set the table, and learned how to make the soup she had served him on the day he returned home. He was not very good at it, but Ruth never complained. Watching him struggle with a cutting board made her laugh in a way he had not heard for years. On Sundays, they invited Yolanda and Horace to join them. The table that had once held one lonely cup of tea was now crowded with bowls, plates, and people talking over one another. Yolanda never admitted that she had left Ruth's badge at reception. Derek never asked. Some truths no longer needed to be spoken because the good they created was already sitting around the table. He simply made sure Yolanda always had a place beside his mother. Ruth watched the two of them argue about how much salt belonged in the soup and smiled, knowing that the friendship formed during those quiet night shifts had become part of their family. Months passed, and Derek's company slowly recovered. The board still expected results, investors still demanded answers, and problems still arrived without warning. The difference was that Derek no longer treated every problem as more important than the people who loved him. He left meetings when dinner began. He learned the names of the cleaning workers in his building and greeted them when their shifts crossed. He asked about their families, their health, and what they needed to work safely. His office still looked clean every morning, but now he understood that clean floors and fresh coffee did not appear by themselves. Someone's tired hands were always behind them. One rainy evening, Derek arrived at Ruth's house later than usual. The food had already cooled, but she had kept his plate covered. He warmed it in the microwave and sat across from her at the kitchen table. Ruth had already eaten, yet she stayed with him, her hands folded near her cup of tea. Derek talked about the clinic's first year and how many families it had helped. Ruth listened, but after a while, he noticed she was no longer looking at the papers he had brought. She was simply watching him eat. Derek smiled. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Ruth did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved across his face as though she were saving the moment somewhere inside herself. Then she reached over and wiped a small drop of soup from the corner of his mouth, exactly as she had when he was a boy. "For 3 years," she said, "I could only watch you from a doorway. Now I get to sit across from you." Derek looked down at his plate as his eyes filled with tears. He reached across the table and took her hand. The calluses had begun to fade, but he could still feel where the mop handle had once rested against her skin. He held that hand gently, knowing it had carried him through childhood, loneliness, and even his own absence. Neither of them said anything else. They did not need to. Outside, the rain tapped softly against the kitchen window. Derek's phone continued buzzing inside the drawer, unanswered. The company waited. The city kept moving. But for the first time in many years, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Epilogue. The true meaning of success. People spend years chasing bigger homes, higher titles, and another zero in the bank. They tell themselves they will call home after the next meeting, visit after the next project, and make time when life finally becomes less busy. But life rarely slows down on its own. One missed call becomes a week, one delayed visit becomes a year, and the people who love us learn to stop asking. Derek once believed success meant having his name on a building. Ruth taught him that real success was having someone waiting at a kitchen table and choosing not to keep them waiting. Money could pay her bills, but it could not sit beside her when the house became quiet. It could not ask about her day, laugh at an old story, or say, "I'm home." Before success asks for another hour of your life, stop and ask yourself one question. Who is still waiting for you to come home?